History remembers him as the man who conquered Europe. But there's a darker truth about Napoleon Bonaparte, a truth that shatters everything you believe about success, power, and love. The higher you climb, the more alone you become. This isn't just philosophical poetry. This is the raw, bleeding reality of every man who dares to chase something immortal. Napoleon discovered this the hard way. Not on the battlefield, not in exile, but in the quiet moments when he reached for the one person he thought would understand his fire. She wasn't there. Josephine had found warmth in another man's arms, while her husband reshaped the world. And in that moment of betrayal, the emperor understood something that would haunt him forever. Most women don't actually want greatness. They want safety. Think about that for a second. The same qualities that make a man extraordinary, his relentless focus, his unwavering vision, his refusal to settle, these are the very traits that make him unlovable to the average heart. Because loving a great man means living in the shadow of his mission. It means accepting that you'll never be the center of his universe. His purpose is. It means watching him disappear into obsession while you crave his attention. It means understanding that he's building something bigger than both of you, and sometimes that construction requires sacrifice. Your sacrifice. Napoleon learned this through letters soaked in desperation. While he commanded armies, he begged for loyalty from one woman. While he conquered nations, he couldn't conquer her heart. Not because he wasn't worthy of love, but because the kind of love he needed, deep, understanding, patient, is rarer than the greatness itself. Most people live their entire lives without understanding this fundamental truth. They think success attracts love. They believe achievement earns devotion. They assume that building an empire will bring them an empress. They're wrong. Here's what actually happens when a man chooses the path of greatness. He becomes a mirror that reflects everyone else's limitations. His discipline exposes their laziness. His vision reveals their small thinking. His silence during deep contemplation gets mistaken for emotional coldness. And rather than rising to meet his level, most people, especially those closest to him, begin to resent the mirror itself. They don't say it directly. They can't. Instead, they whisper things like, "He's always working. He never has time for us. He's become distant. He's changed." But what they really mean is, "His growth makes me uncomfortable with my stagnation." Napoleon saw this pattern everywhere, not just with Josephine, but in his court, among his generals, even with his family. The moment he stopped being manageable, predictable, controllable, the moment he became truly great, people started pulling away, because greatness demands everything from a man. And most people aren't willing to give everything to anything. They want comfort, stability, routine affection, weekend plans that never change. But extraordinary men are storms, not gentle breezes. They think in decades while others think in days. They sacrifice present pleasure for future legacy. They choose the hard conversation over comfortable silence. And storms, no matter how magnificent, are never truly welcomed into quiet homes. Here's the part that will make you question everything you thought you knew about relationships. Women often choose men they can reshape over men who are already magnificent. Not consciously, not maliciously, but instinctively. There's something intoxicating about being the center of someone's world, about having the power to lift someone's mood or destroy their day with a single word. A mediocre man offers this power. He orbits around her emotional needs. His identity becomes tangled with her approval. He adjusts his dreams to fit her comfort zone. She can mold him, shape him, control the temperature of their shared reality. But a man on a mission? A man with fire in his soul and destiny in his bones? He can't be molded. He can only be followed or abandoned. And following requires courage that most people simply don't possess. Following means accepting that some nights he'll work until dawn while she sleeps alone. Following means understanding that his mind lives in a future she can't always see. Following means becoming extraordinary herself, because mediocre partners can't survive in the atmosphere of greatness. Napoleon offered Josephine an empire. She chose the familiar warmth of lesser men. Not because she was evil or shallow, but because empire building is terrifying when you're not built for conquest. Most women don't want to be queens. They want to be comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with wanting comfort until you try to force a king to live in a cottage. Every great man eventually faces this moment of brutal clarity. The world celebrates your achievements while resenting your process. They applaud your results while criticizing your methods. They want the fruits of your obsession without understanding the seasons of sacrifice it took to grow them. Napoleon could command 500,000 soldiers, but he couldn't command one woman's heart to remain faithful. Why? Because commanding an army requires strategy, discipline, and tactical brilliance, qualities he possessed in abundance. But keeping a heart requires something different, something softer, something that great men often can't afford to develop without losing their edge. It requires being emotionally available on demand, dropping everything when tears fall, making your mission secondary to their moods. And the moment a visionary man starts living by someone else's emotional schedule, his vision begins to blur. The moment he starts seeking approval instead of truth, his empire starts crumbling. This is why most extraordinary men end up walking alone, not because they choose isolation, but because they refuse to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's small world. They've tasted the intoxication of building something timeless, and they can't go back to living for temporary pleasures. But here's what Napoleon understood that most men never will. This loneliness isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. The emperor once wrote something that history tried to forget. I have learned that most people fear the very greatness they claim to admire. Think about the men you know who've achieved something significant, really achieved it. Notice how people talk about them when they're not around. There's always this undercurrent of resentment, this subtle undermining, this quiet celebration whenever they stumble, because their success is a constant reminder of what's possible when someone refuses to settle for average. And that reminder is unbearable for those who've chosen comfort over conquest, women included, especially women. Because while society tells them to seek successful men, their hearts often crave something different. Men they can fix, guide, and emotionally manage. A broken man who needs healing gives her purpose. A confused man who needs direction gives her control. An insecure man who needs validation gives her power. But a complete man? A man who knows his worth and chases his vision regardless of who's watching? That man doesn't need her. He might want her, enjoy her, even love her deeply, but he doesn't need her. And the difference between being needed and being wanted is the difference between security and freedom. Most people choose security every time, even when it means living with someone whose potential they secretly resent, even when it means missing out on the rare magic of walking beside someone who's actually going somewhere. So here's the truth that Napoleon died knowing, and that every great man must eventually accept. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot build an empire while constantly tending to someone else's emotional garden. You cannot chase immortality while being held hostage by mortality's demands. You cannot write your name in history while letting others edit your story for their comfort. The choice is always the same: greatness or approval, legacy or love, purpose or peace. And if you choose greatness, if you choose to become more than what this world expected of you, you must prepare for the loneliness that comes with it. Not because you're unlovable, but because you're uncageable. Not because you're heartless, but because your heart belongs to something bigger than any one person can contain. Napoleon conquered continents, but died in exile, mostly alone. Was it worth it? History answers that question every time someone speaks his name. His legacy outlived every person who abandoned him. His impact transcended every heart that couldn't understand him. And maybe that's the real victory. Maybe the men who walk alone don't lose in the end. Maybe they just play a longer game than everyone else is willing to understand. The mediocre man dies surrounded by people who loved his limitations. The great man dies alone, but his greatness echoes through centuries. Which death would you choose? Because that choice Whether you realize it or not is what determines every other choice you make. Every day you wake up, you're choosing between being loved for who you are and being remembered for who you became. Napoleon made his choice. History vindicated it. The question isn't whether you'll walk alone. The question is whether you'll walk at all, or whether you'll spend your life sitting in the comfortable cage that others have built for your potential, wondering what would have happened if you'd had the courage to break free. The emperor is dead, but his truth lives on. Most people don't want greatness. They want safety. And if you felt the fire of something larger than yourself burning in your chest, then you already know which side of that divide you belong on. The question is, what are you going to do about it?